Morning, Year 13. We're here to talk about Caroline Duffy's poem Beautiful, which could be seen really as four different poems, but I'm going to be arguing that there's enough unity between these four different female figures to suggest a continuity that runs through them. And I'm going to be highlighting two very important things. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the balance of power and ownership between the genders, because I'm going to be arguing that beauty does give women a kind of power, but we'll see that that power is a kind of a curse. It's a double-edged sword, okay? And the second thing I'm going to be doing is looking at the continuity between the figures. There's by no means perfect continuity, but I think Duffy is suggesting that throughout history, women have been treated in a kind of similar way. And I think she's going to be arguing that that is to do with fetishism of the body. And we're going to go from the mythical, looking at Helen of Troy, and looking at Cleopatra, who are, in Cleopatra's case, semi-mythical figures. And then we'll be looking at Marilyn Monroe and Princess Diana, who are obviously historical figures. And once again, I'll emphasize that there will be some kind of continuity. Now, we know typical Duffy, she begins in the mythical. Helen was born of an egg. Those of you who've read the notes on Helen of Troy will know that she was a demigod, wasn't she? She was, in fact, the daughter of Zeus, divinely fair, a pearl, drop-dead gorgeous. Now, what's interesting about Duffy's diction is that we go from the poetic, the traditionally poetic, to the modern, anti-poetic and colloquial, drop-dead gorgeous. I'm going to suggest to you that there's a real reason for this, which is the fact that it seems to echo the language of the tabloid press of today, of the News of the World and the Sun and the Mirror. And these are newspapers that specialize quite often in celebrity gossip and of the kind of objectification and the fetishism of women. So immediately you will notice a connection to Princess Diana, because at first that may not seem apparent. So by using these lexical fields, she shows continuity between these two different figures. Once again, the term a stunner could hardly be something we'd associate with ancient Greece. It's very much, again, a word that we would associate with the tabloid press today. She has these immortal eyes. So quite often we're using a lexical field which shows power, divinity, and this ability to control men. But as we will see, that this is a double-edged sword throughout. The lines, as you'll notice, are short and staccato. She won the heart of every man she saw. They stood in line, sighed, knelt, beseeched, be mine. The rhyme is very interesting there as well, isn't it? It creates this sense of rhythm, this idea that people are working for her. So again, I'm going to emphasize the fact that she does have a kind of power. Beseeched, be mine. But if we look at that italicized word, be mine, and I think the italics works to provide huge emphasis upon that, we're going to see that the power is closely linked to fetishism and to the notion of possession, okay? She married one. Now that should be reminiscent to you of the woman who shopped, because when it says she married one, it takes any significance away from that particular male. It seems almost like a random choice, okay? But every other mother's son swore to be true to her till death, enchanted. Again, we go into this magical lexical field, don't we? That fits in with the whole idea of immortality and being godlike, etc. Her skin's celebrity. Now this is a very important line, because we're going to see this happening throughout this poem. First of all, of course, we see that the skin is personified, but it is also a metonym. Now I'll remind you that a metonym is when you use a part for a whole, and it seems to fit into the feminist objection of patriarchy slicing women's bodies up and treating it as though it is flesh. So if we look at this line, it's an interesting one. Her skin's celebrity could be read as triumphant, okay? as though she's a person that is worshipped by people as we know that celebrities are today. But we'll notice, like I said, she's not taken as a whole human being, is she? Again, very much treated like a metonym. Another thing that you'll notice is it's an anachronism, isn't it? The notion of celebrity is very much a 20th century idea, and it really fits in with the whole idea of the kind of mass media, doesn't it? Duffy, I think, is deliberately being anachronistic here because she wants you to make the connection between Helen and figures like Princess Diana and Marilyn Monroe. Now, I spoke to you earlier about how the marriage didn't seem to mean very much to her, that she married a random figure. She also abandons him with little thought, doesn't she? She leaves her ring, a small coin of a wedding ring left on the bedside table like a tip. Very dismissive of marriage, isn't it? Coin, of course, a very interesting image. Money, commodification. And again, same lexical field, tip, fitting into this idea of everything being monetarized. Later on, I'm going to talk a lot about how we might use ideas of Marxism, of commodity fetishism, and the image idea, the idea of image capitalism, the kind of thing that we see today with Instagram, where your image is worth money. So I want you to see how the image of woman is monetarized, even at this stage in ancient Greece, okay? Another lovely phrase is she leaves her wardrobe empty of the drama of her clothes. Sophia was asking me about swag words earlier. This is most certainly a swag word. Why is that? Well, if we think about the drama of her clothes, it means that she plays different roles according to her wardrobe and what she wears. And this very much fits into one of the most powerful forms of feminist criticism, the notion that femininity and gender is a masquerade, a piece of theatre that you put on. I'd like you to note very quickly that this is something that we see in Jezebel's in The Handmaid's Tale, isn't it? That she wears a costume so that she can impersonate a slut to excite the commander. She puts on this identity, and that identity is achieved through wardrobe. So it seems to link a great deal to the work of the brilliant feminist Judith Butler, who was one of the first people to talk about gender as performance. It's very much within the third wave of feminism, and I will be doing a lecture about that at a different date. Now you'll notice we get into a more staccato aggressive rhythm. It was war, Sisora. 1,000 ships, Sisora. On every one 1,000 men, Sisora, each heaving at an oar. We feel this kind of sinister staccato rhythm as the men prepare for war. Now there seems to be a close relationship, doesn't there, between beauty, ownership, masculinity, and war. As though male reverence for woman almost inevitably leads to some kind of act of ownership, conquest, and contesting who that woman belongs to. And this is why I say the women in the poem often have power, don't they? But that power is deeply ambiguous. And it makes us think of more contemporary things, doesn't it? Her name tattooed upon the muscle of his arm. What is the name tattooed there for? Is it reverence? Is it love for her? Or is it a claim of ownership? And the fact that it's tattooed onto the muscle of his arm seems to link this kind of reverence for women to things related to what we could call toxic masculinity. Ideas of male honor often being caught up in the ownership and control of women. And in extreme cases today, we see that, don't we, in things like honor killing, don't we? Where men's love is seen as a kind of an excuse for violence against women. And this is what this is, isn't it? Those of you who don't know the story should know that when Helen of Troy leaves Greece and goes to Troy, her beauty launches 1,000 ships and the men follow her, and this leads to 10 years of war, doesn't it? Turning over quickly. Now, what's quite interesting is that Duffy deliberately wants you to link Helen of Troy to Princess Diana, a princess with the common touch. Now, of course, that was the cliche, the people's princess, etc., used for Princess Diana. And this is how she connects the four stories, interweaves them. The stories are composite, aren't they? It becomes like a palimpsest, doesn't it, in The Handmaid's Tale. We should not see them as discrete stories, but rather superimposed upon one another. So this link to Princess Diana is very interesting, isn't it? Because it connects the mythical to the everyday. And again, we've talked about this kind of genre of magic realism and the movement from myth to what we could call, more realism. And this is something that Duffy does a great deal in her poems, isn't it? Now, what's interesting is that in the next section of the poem, we'll look at Cleopatra, and she's able to enslave men through lust and controlling their bodies, etc. But I'm going to suggest to you that Helen of Troy seems a bit different. She's clasped in the hero's brawn. Sounds very Hollywoodish, like something out of a romantic novel, doesn't it? But let's look at this over here. Her cries like the bird of calamity. This section of the poem will end with the image of her as a bird in a cage, an image made famous by the great feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, who talked about wealthy women being kept in gilded cages and not realizing that the bars were there. It seems to me in this case that Helen of Troy is actually, in many ways, captured by the power of sensuality. And in that sense, she reminds me of Stella, doesn't she? You know how she is a victim of her own lust of body and her love of sensuality. Because you'll notice here, her cries of what I presume to be orgasm seem like the cries of calamity, of distress. So rather than orgasm and sensual joy and pleasure and erotic pleasure being tied up with an idea of sexual liberation or anything like that, it seems more that they are almost cries of distress. And that is very troubling for the reader. And in the background, notice what happens. Remember, the Greeks rowed out on their boats with her name tattooed on their arms. Now below, the men march with the syllables of her name. Beauty as fame, some said. So immediately we move into the next section of the poem. There is no kind of warning of that. Why would that be? Because I think Duffy wants the characters to bleed into each other, doesn't she? Again, to establish this sense of continuity, okay? And what you'll see is some said, some vowed. Again, we have this rhythm. These are anonymous people. And I'm going to suggest to you that's almost the way the tabloid press works. Some said, sources have said, etc. It shows this kind of mythical talking about, isn't it? Some swore. There are no real facts. We're operating in the level of myth at this particular stage. And she disappears into obscurity. We don't know the real story, but we're left with this incredibly last, sad image. But she lived alone, and her maid kept a little bird inside a cage. Is that not again a kind of metaphor for Helen's life, which is a very sad image of imprisonment that ends it here? Now, she never aged. She sashayed up the river in a golden barge. Again, we now have Cleopatra. She's not named. But what seems clear to me is that Duffy is drawing upon Shakespeare's incredibly famous characterization of Cleopatra in the play Antony and Cleopatra. her barge like a burnished throne, he says in this incredibly famous speech. And what he's doing is he's associating Cleopatra with what Edward Said called Orientalism. Okay? Again, as you guys know, Said, a very famous post-colonial theorist, he often looks at how the West interpreted the East as a place of sensuality, deceit, luxury, laziness, erotic play. And it would distinguish itself from this by having a more Roman idea of military discipline, masculinity, a work ethic, and, marriage controlling sexuality, okay? Now, Duffy seems to be working within these codes, these post-colonial codes of Orientalism. She very famously, as you'll know if you've read my notes, smuggled herself into Caesar's room by being rolled up in a carpet. It's an incredibly fetishized picture, again. You'll notice it on the internet everywhere. And she comes out, of course, naked, dancing, and enraptures Caesar and captures him. So once again, it's a kind of power that women can have. But it's a power that's highly dependent, isn't it, on beauty, on sensuality, and on the body. What's the problem with that? Well, we'll see again. It leads to this kind of fetishization. It doesn't really give you access to the instruments of power, to the public sphere, to government, to armies, etc. It's more to do with kind of reverence and the ability to kind of erotically captivate men. And it works incredibly well on Caesar. We have him gibbering. This is not the kind of image the Romans want for the most powerful man in the world and the first great Caesar. Okay? And we'll notice as this section of the poem gets on, he is completely enchanted and intoxicated with her. Duffy writes very well here, I feel, where she says, silver plate with grapes and honey, yogurt, roasted songbirds, gleaming figs, soft wine, and soaked herself in jasmine-scented milk. Well, that basically encapsulates the imagery of the Oriental sensuality and the idea that he has been enchanted and his reason has been overcome by all of this sensual pleasure, etc. Now, why this is interesting is that when Rome fought Egypt, this is how they characterized Egypt. They said it was a deceitful, duplicitous place where Romans would lose their discipline through sex, through excessive food, drink, magic, etc. So again, we get this archetype, don't we? Disciplined, muscular, Western world versus ill-disciplined, sensual, Oriental world. And it's very much being used here. Notice here that Caesar can say zilch, again, Duffy using a modern colloquial term, taking us out of this period of time, reminding us of the continuity that we'll see later with Princess Diana. Look what happened to Caesar. He can say zilch until his tongue could utter in her mouth. So the only way he could speak is in her mouth, almost as though she's controlling her words. Now this is interesting because this idea of muteness, of taking away voice, would suggest at this particular point that Cleopatra is completely in control and that Caesar has lost his voice. Tough beauty, she played with him. Now this oxymoron's really interesting, tough beauty, because one of the things that we're going to see in Cleopatra that we certainly didn't see in Helen of Troy or any of the other women is this idea of gender fluidity. I'm sure you'll notice that she moves with ease between male and female roles. Did you guys notice that? Here she is, rolling the dice. So she's this kind of sexual goddess, isn't she? But she also knows how to play man games, doesn't she? She's really good at them. And notice this, she's associated with criminality. She slipped her gambling hand into his pouch and took his gold, bit it. Isn't that very male behavior, don't you feel? And very working class style behavior? I'm using an anachronism there. But it's certainly not the behavior you would expect of the Queen of Egypt, is it? Biting the gold, robbing and gambling, etc. It reminds me of the poem we've just studied, The Gambler, doesn't it? Where poetry and gambling were conflated. Now we have this beautiful woman who's able to get occupied in this male province of gambling and deceit. Right, what next? Well, she takes Caesar's head between her teeth. Again, that's an image, almost a predatory image of devouring him. And he crouched in lust. And here's the most damaging of all portraits in this particular poem. She smears lipstick on his mouth, powder on the stubble of his beard. She robs him of this Roman masculinity, doesn't she? She controls him. And not only that, not only does she control him through lust, she then moves into the male world again, doesn't she? She matches him glass for glass. Playing drinking games, sucked lemon, licked at salt. Now, I hope that my class don't know this, but this is obviously the world of tequila slammers that she's talking about, isn't it? So again, a contemporary reference, Duffy playing with history. This is what postmodernism is, young Iman. Postmodernism is the promiscuous linking of styles and historical periods, isn't it? I don't think the pharaohs did tequila slammers, but here Duffy shows them doing that. And that's a feature of postmodernity, not worrying about things like historical accuracy, okay? And here we get all these beautiful sibilant S's, don't we? Sapped and swallowed, sucked. So very onomatopoeic, sensual language. Now, Helen of Troy previously was controlled by her body. Here, Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the world from disciplined Rome, is completely controlled by this woman, by using nothing other than her sexuality, her body. She enchants him, etc. But again, I want you to see that she moves between the male and female worlds with great ease. Here she is drinking pints, okay? Very unfeminine behavior, isn't it? And it just shows that she is absolutely adept at playing the gender game. Remember, we just saw her turning Caesar into a transsexual, and the damage that this does to his reputation is completely lost on him, isn't it? It's like he's lost all reason, okay? And here she is controlling men through her sexuality, almost like some kind of page 3 model from the 1990s. She slips to show her breasts, and every man that night saw them again and appraised her name. Okay, so goddess, yeah? Through her body. But again, we're going to see, is this power that's tied up with objectification what we could call real power? Obviously, on a video, I'm not allowed to say this word, but here he makes love to her as a lad. Again, it seems to fit in with this idea of gender fluidity, that they're able to reverse roles. In Cleopatra's sensual world, gender is a construct, and they move in and out of male roles. Swooning for her flesh, her fingers in his ears, her kiss closing his eyes. This Jamon here, okay, is very effective because it piles image on image, and it shows that he's this kind of sensory overload very effectively. Notice how long this sentence is. It goes all the way from she waved off to war, all the way down, past all of these images of blethering, closing eyes, kisses, etc., snakes and seas. Again, the sibilants create a sense of magic, sensuality, and give the sense that Caesar is entirely lost. So of the woman, I'm going to suggest that she is the closest to female power. But of course, it is through the body. And that in itself is going to be very interesting. Moving on to our next page then. Again, without warning, although we do have these little asterisks here, The camera loved her. And immediately, we the readers need to reorientate ourselves. We need to understand now that we're in the 20th century. What's different? Well, we have the advent of what I'm going to call visual capitalism, okay? And film theorists often talk about the camera as being a kind of voyeur, something that watches women's bodies in particular. The very big theme within feminist criticism of film is the way that the camera will be a kind of peeping Tom that allows the male gaze to objectify a woman over and over again. My lecturer at UEA, Laura Melby, is the person who came up with this theory, okay? So the camera loved her. It was personified, okay? It adored the waxy pouting of her mouth. Now you'll notice again, we're going to get into the realm of synecdoche, when we cut people up into their little body parts. Synecdoche is a form of metonymy. Do you remember? A metonym is a part for a whole. She breathed the script out of her little voice. Very different now kind of female power from Cleopatra. Cleopatra, in many ways, appropriated male power. And what Marilyn Monroe does is she puts on a little girl voice. So it's a different kind of female power, isn't it? They filmed her famous, filmed her beautiful. The fricative Fs here show a new kind of power, and this is a power of having the image as a commodity. Now we know that Duffy's really interested in commodity fetishism. We've seen that with the woman who shopped, where she goes out and buys loads of stuff in different shops. But here the power is going to come through the image. You may or may not have picked up on some of the historical references here. An athlete licked the raindrops from his fingers to quench his thirst. She married him. This is a reference to Joe DiMaggio, who in America was the most famous baseball player at the time, who married Marilyn Monroe. And I think what Duffy's getting at here now is the idea of a kind of America's sweetheart, which is what Marilyn Monroe was. But this image, this persona was entirely fictitious. And at this stage, we're talking about when Hollywood was controlled by the studio system, and they were able to manufacture a kind of identity. The US whooped, again, very modern kind of language. And now we get into a very disturbing part of the poem, where clearly there's a conflation between filming and sex. And it represents film as a kind of pornography. They filmed her harder, harder, till her hair was platinum. Now that's interesting. It's almost like the sex turned her into the blonde. And I think that this is very interesting, because the world's most famous blonde, of course, wasn't blonde. So it reminds us with female images that often men and patriarchy will sculpt them into versions of themselves, which are entirely artificial. We're going to come back to this image when we look at the end of the Monroe bit, which is about her pubic hair being dark. And that, in a sense, is seen as her real self. Whereas this filmed image, created through this kind of pornographic filming, is the artificial masquerade of who she was, yeah? Now notice this, guys. Her eyes, sapphires pressed by a banker's thumb. Again, Duffy's sending out signals to us, reminding us of the link between capitalism, female beauty, the film industry, and money. So behind all of these people, behind the cameras, is the banker's thumb, and the idea that we should commodify the woman. And we're going to see this in Princess Diana, as some of you know, that if a paparazzi guy could take a big photo, and I'm going back to like the 90s, they could get £1 million for a photo. So we've got this extraordinary idea in which the image becomes a commodity. Here's another lovely image. Sophia, productive quote. Her skin invests gold. You got everything there. Her skin is the metonym, isn't it? It's a part for a whole. It makes her seem flesh, like she's been harvested or butchered, doesn't it? And it conflates skin with gold, with money. So you've got everything there in that one quote. That would be a quote that we could use to create a paragraph very easily. Now, her second marriage is to a poet. This is a reference to someone you all know, Arthur Miller. And again, the whole world swooned. And the W's there help to create a real sense of wonder, together with the long ooh sound, okay? The whole world swooned. It reminds us of Helen of Troy, doesn't it? Again, a kind of power, we could argue. But is she really in control of that power, is what Duffy seems to be asking us. And now, you'll notice this is clever here, dumb beauty. Duffy's been using ions, that's unstressed and stressed syllables, most of the time. Now, the use of a trochee, a kind of trochea meter, dumb beauty. Dumb being such a clever word to choose, because the dumb blonde, the fact that Marilyn constantly had to play a dumb blonde and was very frustrated by this. The only time she got out of playing dumb blondes is when Arthur Miller wrote a part for her in the beautiful film The Misfits, and she played a wonderful role. So here we have a sense of the fact that whenever patriarchy fetishizes a woman, contempt is also close, isn't it? Dumb blonde. But dumb is wonderful because it also means, of course, mute, doesn't it? And so, therefore, dear class, you'll all be thinking of Offred, won't you? And this idea of muting woman's voice. She slept in an eye mask. So what I want you to see here is the juxtaposition between this idea of this sculpted self, the image of Monroe controlled by the Hollywood studios, and this section of the poem, which is all about the broken reality. So was this power? No, because it's fueled by coffee, pills, and booze. It's the curse of the celebrity and stardom, and the idea that that celebrity actually devours and destroys you, which is a story so familiar to us in the 20th and 21st century, isn't it? Okay. And here we have a sense of patriarchy's exploitation of her. Happy birthday to you, happy birthday, Mr. President, is a reference to Marilyn Monroe singing happy birthday to JFK, and the fact that JFK is rumoured to have used her as one of his concubines and had sex with her. They filmed on, deep, dumped what they couldn't use. Again, we've got the pornographic references here, haven't we? And the Ds are very powerful, along with the asyndetic listing. Deep, dump what they couldn't use on the cutting floor. Again, you will realize that this idea of splicing relates to The Handmaid's Tale, doesn't it? Of a mutilated narrative. And again, of course, it would be male editors who do this. So you're going to link to Professor Picciotto, aren't you? And it will also be male studio people who decide the narratives. So even though Marilyn Monroe is reputed to have this power, there's always a puppet master behind the scenes, sculpting, slicing, splicing, and creating the image which is consumed by us, the public. And this is very powerful. Look at what happened to the rhythm. Quiet, please, action, cut. Quiet, please, action, cut. Quiet, please, action, cut.